Today's book review is about Shoe Dog. Is Shoe Dog by Phil Knight, a memoir by the creator of Nike. If you are someone that is interested in the sport of running, if you are someone that is interested in being an entrepreneur, if you are someone that's just interested in reading a powerful story about building something, about creating something, this could be a great book for you. So what is it? Well, first of all, it's a memoir. Now, to start with, I have a rule, which is I always try to keep in mind when I'm reading books like this, I'm reading memoirs, is that you always have to take into context who's writing the book. So in this case, this is a book that's written by Phil Knight. It is a book that he writes about his time founding the company of Nike. And in particular, the way the book is organized, it is almost 400 pages. The font's not too small, so it's a decent read. This is I read a lot of other people. I've seen their videos where they read it in a long extended sitting. Me myself, I read it over the course of about 3 days of reading, and so it's a quick read. It flows well. Phil's a great writer, and the way the book is organized, it basically covers a 10-year period that were pivotal in the founding of the shoe company Nike. So it starts when the company was first created, and then it covers for 10 years as the company goes from nothing to basically having an IPO and becoming a public company. And throughout that time period, there are a ton of trials and tribulations that Phil Knight goes through with the creation of the company. There are issues with customs. There are lawsuits that he has to go with. There are intellectual property violations. There are hiring employees. There are firing employees. There are the logistics of scaling up a company. There are competition with businesses. There is tragedy with the athletes that work on the Nike payroll. All those things happen in a 10-year period. And at the same time, he's building his own family. And so Phil takes a second to step back and write that story. And I think the reason why he wrote this book, aside from sell the story, is that the reason he talks about it is that he said he wrote the story for his grandchildren. He wanted his grandchildren to understand and know about the creation of the company. Now, I also think that the reason Phil probably did it is just, for his own legacy, right? It's a lot easier when you can take time and write your own story of what you think the past was, as opposed to, letting somebody else control the narrative. So I think there's a huge part of that as well around writing a memoir. But, the thing that is great about it is that he talks a lot about, in his acknowledgments of spending time, it looks like in a college writing class and sitting with undergraduates as they're going through writing. And you can tell he's a very gifted writer, just how he constructs the different passages. He does a really good job at the beginning of each chapter to grab you in. And he does a really nice job as well at the end of each chapter to kind of close the loop and close the circle in a lot of ways, using grammar and syntax to do that. So it's pretty clever. You can definitely tell he picked up some writing styles, things that I paid attention to, in the hopes that I could write like that someday. But so he's a great writer, and it's obviously a great story. So overall, what are my thoughts on this book? Well, there's a couple things that I took away. So the first one is, as an entrepreneur, I can also relate to this story. I don't think I will ever build a company. Peregrine will never be, a multi-billion-dollar company like Phil's, Nike. But there are a lot of the similar challenges to go through. And so one of the things that he talks a lot about is that he has this phrase, which is that if you can't win, try not to lose. And I think that's an interesting phrase because, the story of Phil, he was a runner. He ran the University of Oregon. He ran on the legendary coaches there. But he wasn't the guy who was always winning, but he was good. And so he really had to focus a lot on just being better and better than he was the day before, and focus on, if you can't win the race, let's try not to lose. And losing could mean a variety of things. It could be not quitting on yourself. It could mean not quitting on the last lap. You can define it in a lot of ways. And so Phil talks a lot about this idea of you don't always have to win, as long as you don't lose and as long as you keep moving forward. That's a constant theme in the book. And I think as an entrepreneur or anyone building something, that's a cool idea to have. The second one is, if you are a fan of the sport of running, it's tough to beat this book. I mean, one of my other favorite books is this book right here called Kings of the Road. And this was about the boom of the American running boom that happened in the 1970s and a little bit into the 1980s when Bill Rogers, Alberto Salazar, when those guys were running the marathon, and Frank Shorter during that time period. And Phil Knight's Nike comes a little bit at the tail end of that, but into kind of the Alberto era. And it's just neat because it's a cool story of running, and you see a lot of the famous names in the sport throughout the book. I mean, the book is Steve Prefontaine, which is a huge part of the legacy of Nike, and Phil Knight. And you see some of those references in the book as well, so that's really interesting. So if you are a fan of the sport of running, even if you're not a fan of being an entrepreneur or building a company, this is actually kind of an interesting book as well. And the final one, and I think this is the most interesting thing for me, is that I left this book appreciative of the story of building Nike and appreciative of the story of Phil Knight. But I think the biggest thing I walked away with was a really big appreciation for the co-founder of Nike, who was Bill Bowerman. Now, this is another amazing book that I read. This is about Bill Bowerman, and he was the head coach of the track club at the University of Oregon when Phil Knight ran there, as well as, when Prefontaine and other people as well. And he is the tinkerer and the innovator behind Nike. And I think I knew that, but maybe not in quite as much detail. And Phil Knight talks a lot about it. And I think he gives Bill credit where credit is due. Of course, this is his memoir, and so, whereas Bill Bowerman was the guy who invented the waffle shoes that made Nike famous and did a lot of the great shoe innovations and the key shoe designs and the modifications in the history of the sport. And Phil gives credit to that. Phil gives a lot more credit to just the logistics and the infrastructure and the business negotiation of building the company, and I think that's important too. But at its heart and soul, Nike had a lot of innovative products that helped it break out and to stand alone. And this is the guy that did it all. And you don't get a ton of that in the book. You sort of just get a teaser. And so I think the biggest takeaway for me is that it made me really appreciate Bill Bowerman and made me go back to this book and just read a few different passages where the two people intersect and just kind of get the different sides of the story. But this is a fantastic book. Just the history of Bill Bowerman. I mean, the guy's an incredible human being. And, and he just so happened to also be the co-founder of Nike. So I think that was probably my biggest takeaway, is that it's a great book. It's a great story about how someone who, despite all the obstacles in his upbringing, his talents, and the forces of the world conspiring against him, was still able to build a multi-billion-dollar company of Nike by not always winning, but by not losing and by not giving up and not going forward, and being introduced to two really compelling characters in the sport of running, Phil Knight as well as Bill Bowerman, makes it a book that is worth putting on your running reading list.